DrMaxineDavis. I'm a scholar and second generation activist. I'm going to welcome you today into my office. So come to the desk of Dr. Davis and let's have a very honest and transformative conversation and just informal chat about the road and difference between being an ally and a co-conspirator. I first learned about the difference in these terms and what they consist of from the amazing Feminista Jones. Definitely follow her and check her out if you haven't already been exposed to her work and her very nuanced and transformative perspectives on social justice in many regards. She's amazing. And so I'm grateful to have been introduced to this concept by her work that she's written about as early as, I believe, 2014 or 2015. I only recently learned of this difference, again, from her contributions within the last 3 or so years. As we jump into this conversation, I want to share a few anecdotes and reflections on how I arrived at the thinking that I have now about this topic. And I'd like to start with the concept of vulnerability. And so I'll take you along the road of why that's important. But in line with that, I come to you on very different terms than I usually present myself publicly. What I mean is, this is one of very few appearances that I will make and have made without full-blown hair and makeup. And if you want to learn more about the idea of performance and how we show up in spaces, I've drawn on and been influenced by the work in thinking about performance, whether it's performance of gender or other perspectives and identities by Kenji Yoshino. I'll provide links below so you can check out all these great folks who have really shaped and influenced my thinking. But the reason why I say that and share that I'm coming to you full naked face is because I think it's a good representation of the concept of vulnerability in having this discussion. So the reason why that's important is in order to begin to explore and dig into where you actually lie on the continuum between being an ally, an accomplice, or a co-conspirator, it is a non-negotiable requirement that you engage in reflective honesty. And Dr. LaShonda Fields and I have previously written in the New Social Worker a really important piece, again, that I'll link below, spotlighting what performative allyship is. And as we wrote that piece, one thing that really drove the desire for myself and her to spotlight performative allyship as something that social workers should think about is this self-appointment that oftentimes people of privileged identities give themselves. So, for example, if you consider yourself an ally, who told you that's what you were? Did you just decide that? Or did somebody identify you in that way? The additional things that I have to add to this conversation, in addition to the non-negotiable requirement of honesty in naming where you are and why, is to provide some examples of what I see as being necessary to be a co-conspirator, whether it's racial justice, LGBTQ justice, immigrant rights and protecting and championing and standing in partnership with folks who are undocumented in the US and UK and other wealthy nations, whether it's spotlighting the voices of indigenous people and their fight and plight continuously through the past few centuries. This is applicable to a variety of settings. So in order to advance the conversation, again, I'm going to provide you some very specific examples in my own life of where I lie on the continuum in various facets of this work. So I'll start by sharing that this continuum is wider even than those three categories. And Dr. Tiffany, I'm drawing on the work of Dr. Tiffany's sort of categorization of what this continuum will look like and what it comprises of. I think there's even a pre-stage or additional categories that we need to think about when discussing this. So for example, even before allyship, folks need to be honest about the fact that they're not even an ally, that oftentimes they're an adversary. And I'm talking about us. I'm talking about social work students. I'm talking about social work professors. I'm talking about people in academia. I'm talking about the wide range. And if you know me a little bit, you know I do not sugarcoat. I'm going to tell you how it is. Sometimes I'm a little gentle just to bring the folks in. But we have to be honest about the fact that in certain areas of our lives, we are not even an ally. And we have to name when we are an adversary to certain groups and populations, when we are indifferent to the violence and pain and oppression of certain groups. This is a precursor to even having this discussion. Honesty is required and it can be very uncomfortable for you as you have this conversation in your classrooms or as you discuss in panels like the one that this video will be used for. I think that a couple of key things I would like to add to the conversation that I haven't seen talked about a lot is if you aren't making any sacrifices, any personal lasting sacrifices, you are not an ally. You're not an accomplice, and you're definitely not a co-conspirator. So if you don't have skin in the game, if you haven't stuck your neck out to your potential own detriment in very tangible ways, you don't get to call yourself a co-conspirator. Allyship, based on some of the work that's again been written about, is the idea that you're committed to social justice and equity in theory, and you're in the thinking and sort of learning stage, but you haven't really moved to reactive action. And co-conspiratorship is you being proactive. But again, I'd like to add that co-conspiratorship if that's the highest level we aspire to reach, has to include self-sacrificing behaviors. So you might be aware of my public discussion about experiencing anti-Black racism in academia at my previous institution and the very tangible ways that happens. And unfortunately, there were few and far between co-conspirators who actually spoke up to the threat of their own position and to the threat of having their resources infringed upon because they had my back simply for telling the truth in an oppressive social work environment. I could name them on one hand. Speaking of naming things on one hand, this might be jarring for folks, just as a bit of a warner, just as a bit of a warning. But something that is really at the forefront of my mind right now is the idea that I can count on one hand people, if we were in chattel slavery, white folks who would actually come free me. I think a lot of people think they would or talk about their aspiration and desire to want to actively do liberatory practice work, but somebody sacrificing and being willing to risk their own life, health, wealth, stability, economic and social status, as being able to risk all of that in exchange for my freedom, in exchange for me to actually be free, those people come far and few between. And I say that very intentionally because it's my lived reality. And unfortunately, I think a lot of Black folks probably feel that way, that if they were literally in chains, there are very few non-Black folks who they know without a shadow of a doubt would risk it all to come and free them. This is hard to talk about. And again, just because it's hard and uncomfortable doesn't mean that we are able to shy away from it. Another idea I'd like to spotlight about vulnerability, and again, like coming to you, no makeup face, and I love hair and makeup and just the stuff of it all. I am doing that from a very privileged perspective, in that I hold conventional standards of beauty, even as a Black woman. For example, I have a lot of symmetry in my facial features. I'm in a smaller sized body than I have been previously. I am not battling any skin condition that would impact the texture of my face. And so I share that to really highlight the need to recognize that when we talk about vulnerability, and some of y'all may be familiar with Brene Brown's work and the justifiable critique of sort of a wide blanket need for vulnerability. Being vulnerable has different degrees of impact and consequences based on who you are and what identities you hold in our societies. So again, I'm talking about vulnerability, giving you these very tangible personal reflections and examples so that you can think about how this translates to your own life and your own presentation and how you do this work as a aspiring social justice leader and social worker. Vulnerability, sometimes I can't be my full self. And sometimes spaces aren't deserving of me to be completely vulnerable and bring my entire true fullness to the table. And that's okay. So I choose, because of knowing the potential ramifications of being fully vulnerable and being completely transparent. I choose when it's safe for me to do that and when it's not. As a Black woman, I cannot always be vulnerable. If I were, I would be characterized even more than I already have been as being angry and perpetuating this idea of Black rage as being unjustified and unjustifiable and inappropriate and unprofessional. So I have to choose how I'm vulnerable. I just want you to think about that in the context of this conversation. So, in terms of allyship, as sort of stage one, the thinking and learning stage, there are certain areas that, again, that I consider myself, based on my actions and previous actions and ongoing actions, as falling into various camps along this continuum. One area that I am an aspiring ally is in the space of disability, understanding disability rights movement and disability studies. And I am very much at a pre-ally stage even, especially in terms, and this is regardless of what I hold. I have invisible disability, and so I've been able to not be exposed in that way. And just because I'm technically part of this community doesn't mean that I'm capable of being any less harmful to someone who has no disability, as harmful as someone who has no disability at all. I'm not comfortable yet even sharing what my invisible disabilities consist of and what they are, because of internalized oppression in this area. I think one day I will, but I'm just not there yet. And one of the reasons why I say I'm an aspiring ally is that I am in the process of just thinking at the pre-stage about how ableism shows up in my own life and how I perpetuate ableism on a regular and ongoing basis. I'm only beginning to intentionally seek out reading scholars and community members' reflections and works in this space. And I don't have to. Like, I literally could probably skirt the rest of my career without challenging myself in this way. But this is something that I want, this is an area that I consider my weakest and that I want to grow in. So I could see someone potentially viewing me as an ally because of how vocal I am related to racial justice or other social justice efforts, and just assume that I am a co-conspirator in dismantling ableism and fighting against oppression related to disability and people who have disabilities. But in all reality, I am in a very infantile stage of even thinking and learning about these things. So that's an example of me sharing with you my reflections on an area that I think it's important to be vulnerable and share, that I'm not at an idealized state in this way. So for you, that might show up in sort of your relationship to the LGBTQ community, or trans folks' experiences that might show up for you in relationship to how you are positioned in the fight for racial justice. Let's be honest, all social workers are not allies or conspirators in the fight against racial inequity and racial disparity. A lot of folks are active adversaries who perform allyship because they value what it looks like from a public perspective. And if you read the article that Dr. Fields and I wrote, I provide, again, some tangible ways that you can think about if you are doing performative allyship. So that is a key facet of this conversation that I'd like to add. Lastly, again, I want to emphasize this need to really examine what sacrifices you have and haven't made. And the soon-to-be Dr. William Frey out of Columbia University School of Social Work is a white man who I think talks about this in a way that is accessible, and I've learned a great deal from him in terms of what that sacrifice looks like. And again, these sacrifices have to transcend the personal and professional. You cannot claim to be a co-conspirator in the fight against anti-Black racism and Black injustices in your professional spaces, but then go home and be silent when faced with bigotry and comments and even proximity to family members or friends who are actively harmful to Black people. And that is so central to the conversation about, again, performative allyship, but also co-conspiratorship. So this sort of skin in the game concept that I want to spotlight as something that I think is transformative in the conversation means that if you haven't lost relationships, if you haven't lost economic opportunity, if you haven't sacrificed and lost status socially or professionally because of your commitment to being resistant to ongoing and active oppression, you ain't no co-conspirator. So again, what have you sacrificed? What are you willing to sacrifice? And having the honest reflection and honest discussion about those topics are really what I see as being necessary to be a ethically grounded and just social worker of integrity. This is an integrity issue. You can't say you're something and then your actions reflect something totally different. That's harmful and harmful to you, harmful to others, harmful to the field. I am a proud fighter for sexual and gender minoritized folks. And I haven't always been here. Prior to my first course on human sexuality in my undergraduate psychology education, I was more than adversarial. I was actively oppressive. And as I learned and expanded my education around sexuality and gender and sex and gender presentation, it's been an ongoing journey that I am so grateful to have evolved. There are transformative moments in your life that you can reflect on and say, thank God I had that moment, because it reshaped everything for me. And so what that means is that I've gone many hours, weeks, days without talking to my own mom because of my willingness to sacrifice relationship for justice and freedom. And anybody who knows me knows how near and dear my mama is to me. It doesn't matter. Like, I'm going to reject and respond to every small little thing that oppresses LGBTQ plus folks when they're not anywhere near the room. And that personal sacrificing sort of, and what I call kitchen table advocacy, is necessary in professional and personal spaces. So again, this is an area, and I'm not spotlighting this to kind of give myself a pat on the back. I'm just trying to give you real examples. And that's why I wanted to give you both in terms of areas that I have grown and transformed over the years, and to an aspirational place. And I still have aspirational goals related to freeing and upending oppression in that area, and also give you an example of somewhere that I am very early stages of even thinking about. So that's me being vulnerable, and I hope it's helpful to you as you consider where you are on the continuum and where you desire to be. So I think one final scholar reflection that embodies the power of language and how we describe ourselves and where we're actually positioned is the Twitter handle or title of Lee Goodmark, a law professor that I've learned a lot from, in addition to Angela Davis and Beth Ritchie, on the road that I'm taking to become an aspirational abolitionist. Lee Goodmark's handle or title on Twitter is Recovering Carceral Feminist. And she could title herself a number of ways. But this is an example of honest language and how we describe ourselves in relationship to oppression and systematic violence. Recovering Carceral Feminist. Thank you for listening to me and having this conversation. Again, I'm incredibly honored and privileged to have been invited to this panel. And I encourage you to pursue the lifelong journey of growth and education beyond the classrooms that you're in as MSW students, or whoever watches this video, because I think it's so important that I'm going to share it on a wider platform. Do the work, read the books, listen, and take care of yourself. Peace.